when were the Crusades, and then what was the real motivation behind them? If the holy dimensions, as I think I ascertained from reading, were more of a public facing sort of justification than the real motivation behind them.
So we're talking 11th century, right? Mostly the Crusades. I mean, as you know, there were many of them, 4 or 5 different crusade um, uh, attacks in the Middle East, and then there were some crusaders, who attacked the Cathars, for example, in southern France, and that sort of thing. I mean, the Crusades were meant to be a kind of a religious campaign in order to seize the Holy Land from the so-called Saracens, the alien Muslim peoples of the region, and from Arabs or Arab opponents. And, they're a complicated piece of medieval history in which lots of different things are at work, including the fact that many of these knights and people who went on the Crusades, had no money and were broke, and were looking for, a way to kind of enrich themselves, and to also to, I wouldn't diminish their religious motivations, but their religious motivations were in some ways they could get rid of their sins. They could be cleared of any debts and things like this if they went on these crusades. So then they go to the Middle East. They end up in various parts. I mean, one of the Crusades, they basically destroy Byzantium, which is itself a Christian, is a Christian empire. And they destroy the heart of Byzantium in Constantinople and run away with all the goods, and they start shipping things back and stuff like that. And then they go into Jerusalem and slaughter people, right? And so I felt like I had to include the Crusades in genocide, again, because of the intentional mass slaughter that occurred, especially in Jerusalem, but in other parts of the Middle East as well. Wherever the Crusaders went, they slaughtered people. And they did it in part for material reasons, in part because they thought they were doing it in the name of the glory of God, in part because the Pope sent them, and in part because things back home were pretty bad. So, they were trying to solve a lot of their own problems, through a genocidal action. I think that's the way I described it in my book a little bit. I use the word genocidal in a very specific way, like genocide. But I'm not ready really to call it genocide. In that sense, again, I want to emphasize here again that I don't want to get involved, yay, nay, genocide, not genocide. What I want to do is say, okay, this is a piece of human history that has a resemblance to other pieces of human history where similar kinds of things are done, which is to say mindless mass slaughter of people indiscriminately, not for necessarily warlike goals or aims to defeat an enemy, but to kill them, again, using that crucial little phrase in the convention, as such, to just destroy them. And so Jerusalem then, people say, 5 feet of blood and that kind of thing in the streets of Jerusalem, or however many feet they describe it. And there was just a tremendous slaughter of everybody, and sometimes even of Christians. I mean, that was the odd thing about it. They didn't really discriminate very much. They just slaughtered everybody. And some people would argue, well, maybe that's not genocide. But again, I don't want to get in that argument. I want to just sort of, as I say, describe this kind of action. And the Pope has a lot to do with it, and the the assertion of papal supremacy and the way the Pope then can sort of redistribute wealth and power, through the success of the Crusaders, which was, fundamentally a materialist it combined, Christian fervor with materialist goals.
When I hear the moniker Saracen, I think Lemort d'Arthur and all of that lore. Lemort d'Arthur. Yeah, and all those texts, I was at one point quite familiar with them, but they're indicative, I think, in a similar way to the Bible for prehistory of the attitudes, in this case, moral sentiments and beliefs of the time, or at least a few hundred years later when Le Morte d'Arthur was written, but others like Chrétien de Troyes' works or the Kings of England, those came before. But that brings us to the Pope, who you said sent them to the Holy Land. And on what basis? And I still find it hard to wrap my head around. Did the Pope condone the rape, the murder, and the pillage, and all of that went on during the Crusades?
I mean, again, I'm not a specialist in medieval Europe or on the popes, so I'm hesitant to comment, except to say I don't think the Pope cared. I mean, I think he was ready to see, especially Urban, was ready to see the kind of death and destruction. It didn't matter; these were infidels, and the infidels, their destruction did not mean much to him at all. These were not Christians, and as a result, I mean, some of them were Christians actually, but I think in general the Pope was looking out for his power and his wealth and his influence, and the conquering, if possible, of Jerusalem for his kingdom, right, on earth. And, therefore I don't think it mattered much at all. And you do get, scattered, reports from some people who thought this was awful, from churchmen and that kind of thing. But in general, I think the Pope approved as long as he got his cut. And I'm afraid, that was the politics, of the papacy at that point.
Well, one last thing about the Crusades, and then we can move on closer to us in history. But I saw and was quite surprised that cannibalism was a non-negligible part of the Crusades. And I was wondering why this was and whether it's common in genocide. So before you answer, later on as I was reading that in the communist genocide in China under Mao, there was cannibalism and necrophagy, but this was different because people were starving. But I imagine that in this case, at least, I mean, the othering of the slaughtered dehumanizes them to the point that it lessens any inhibitions typically associated with eating people and when you're hungry. But I'm just wondering if cannibalism is pretty common in genocide, or this was and China were more isolated cases.
Well, it's an interesting question. I think you have to take maybe a step back and say what frequently happens in genocidal situations is that there's famine, there's hunger, sometimes brought on by the political authorities themselves in various ways, purposefully brought on, in other words, by the political authorities, which is what I've argued about, Ukrainian famine in 32, 33. Some scholars would say famine is always essentially political. You're choosing who eats and who doesn't. So
that's the case with China.
But keeping that in mind, I think it's more or less, let's put it that way, political. In the case of the Crusades, my understanding is that what happened is that they, big armies got caught with no food. right? And that the available captives and victims of those armies were then sometimes eaten in cannibal-like situations. But it's the shortage of food that does it. In other words, I don't think cannibalism is an act of genocide. I haven't really thought about that in the terms that you put it. I don't think it's necessarily an act of genocide. I think what it is much more the result of the sheer shortage of food. And, desperation on the part of people. We're built to do a lot of nasty things. When I say we, I mean human beings can do all kinds of nasty things. I don't think we're necessarily built to be cannibals, but we can be. And that's the sad story. Now, another thing to say that occurred to me when you were asking your question is that there were kind of taboos about what historians talked about, for a long time, even dealing with genocide. So, cannibalism, along with something like rape, was something you just didn't talk about. You didn't analyze, you didn't, get to the bottom of, you didn't try to document, you didn't count the numbers. That's changing. I mean, we have fewer proscriptions on what we talk about in history, which is, I think, a good thing. But for a while, that wasn't considered something, that was tasteful or worth exploring. People understood it had happened. But we also sort of tended to think, well, these were done by cannibals, meaning primitive peoples, not by Western peoples or advanced peoples or that sort of thing. And now we know that that's not true either. So I think that's part of the story that historians didn't like to talk about it. They didn't like to document it. But that's changing. That's changing. And I see this, for example, again, I follow the Ukrainian stuff pretty closely these days. I see that people are really, when I say the Ukrainian stuff, I mean historical studies on 32-33 in particular, where there was vast hunger, right? And there was a lot of cannibalism. And people are now, documenting it. I mean, trying to show it. The same thing with the Chinese case, Mao case, for a long time, people didn't talk about this at all. And then, some Chinese scholars began to discover these documents, some of which I cited in the world history. Documents were coming from the countryside to the city saying, we have 12 cases of cannibalism. We have 15 cases of cannibalism, and I think what's happening there is not cannibalism, again, being used as an instrument of genocide, but that starvation, is something that, the Mao and the Chinese leadership was ready to suffer through. And therefore, the people were left to their own devices. And in some cases, this meant cannibalism.
Though you say that cannibalism arises out of the desperation that comes from famine, that's often a part of genocide, I still think that now that I think about it, that there's a crucial difference between the Crusade case and the Chinese case, in that in the case of the Crusades, it was the aggressing army that was cannibalizing the victims, whereas in the Chinese genocide, it was the victims being forced to self-cannibalize.
Yeah, but in both cases, I mean, in the case of the Chinese, it was the Chinese government that set up that situation, right? And the Chinese party, CCP, that basically created the situation in which cannibalism could occur. And in the case of the Crusades, I mean, it's the Crusaders, right, who are doing it, but they also help create that situation in which they're hungry, in which they need to eat. And, I was thinking about your hypothesis, more or less, that because they were the other, they were easier to eat. I mean, again, this is the kind of subject scholars usually don't talk about, but it's worth, like I said, it's worth broaching, that's worth broaching. I don't know if that's necessarily true. I mean, uh, might be easier to might be easier to eat your own kind versus eating somebody else, right? I mean, they're more alien, and therefore maybe you don't want to. You're worried about poisoning yourself by eating. So I think it works. I think it works both ways. I don't think what you say necessarily. I mean, I've not studied it, but my impression is not the same as yours there.